It was nice this morning. It's great. I'll take it. When it turned cloudy, windy, cold, rainy. It's cold. Yeah, the temperature dropped. Yeah, it's about 10 now. Going down to 1 or 2. Could be snow.
Snow is forbidden. It's not allowed. Snow now.
Ah, yeah. There's snow in Mount Royal. My friends was out. Just to walk up Mount Royal. There's snow. Yeah, lots of. It's not the parts that are shady.
Yeah.
Wow. I have so much to talk about. I don't think I'm gonna finish, but we'll see where it goes.
What are you already talking about?
Well, one of them was, it's the Passover time now.
Yeah.
And it refers to something that, according to the Bible, it happened.
Yeah.
The question is there a way to know if it's happened?
Yeah. You know,
And I was just in Egypt. I was just in Egypt last fall. So I got to see unbelievable. It's so mind-boggling how much those people made. 3,000 I'm talking almost 5,000 persons wrote something about the votes of the modern times about that. It's unbelievable what they put in.
and they're still standing.
And they're still standing for it. They're beautiful. It's amazing.
So would you like me to introduce you or?
No, whatever you like.
Okay.
Is it you? Do you have anything to say?
Yes.
Sure.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday's Mr. Dwoskin lectures. Please turn off your cell phones, please, for no disruptions. I have a few announcements to make. So tomorrow we will have a movie playing here. It's for National Canadian Day. You don't need registration, just show up here. The producer and the director will be here and they will introduce the movie and then there will be a question and answer period at the end. Then next Tuesday, we have Mr. Dwoskin again. On Wednesday, the 23rd, there is a rent workshop called Lease Transfers that you need to register. It's at 6 p.m. and it will be held in the multipurpose room. Next weekend, we will have the used book sale, which will be here in the auditorium. Then on the 4th of May, there will be Jane's Walk. For that, you have to register. You just need to go to the library website and enter your information. And they will be talking about the history of Cavendish Boulevard. So, Mr. Dwoskin, here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. I have quite a number of topics I thought about speaking today. And I'm not sure if we'll be able to finish all of them, but I thought might as well start with something that seems pretty obvious, which is that so we're gonna forget about politics and we're gonna forget about everything that you hear about in the news today for just for a little bit. But ever since I was a child, going to Jewish school and learning about Passover, it was about the most remarkable story that you could possibly think of. And it's a story which purports to tell about the formation of the Jews as a people, which is that these different groups of people were enslaved in Egypt. They were brought out of Egypt in a miracle. The Red Sea parted, and in the Sinai Desert, the Jews became a people. So that's the story. That's the kind of the genesis, we'll say, to coin a word, of the Jewish people. And it's such a remarkable story that it's kind of stuck with pretty well everyone ever since. Now, for people who are Christian, of course, the Easter story, which is a kind of almost a parallel, does begin at the same time as Passover because Jesus was celebrating Passover at the time. So the two stories in a way are interlinked. You have one that goes from slavery to freedom, and another one that goes from death to life. And, there's a certain parallel in that. Last November, I spent 2.5 weeks in Egypt. And of course, when you go to Egypt, you get to see all of the most amazing structures that were ever built, pretty well by human beings in those days. It's hard to describe seeing in person what you've seen in pictures. It's hard to describe looking at the pyramids, for example, and saying to yourself, how is it possible that 5,000 years ago, someone could have built a structure which would last 5,000 years with such precision, with such beauty, without modern tools, without cranes, without computers, without trucks, without any kind of modern equipment that you can imagine, that they could have built a structure that lasted 5,000 years. The Champlain Bridge lasted 60 years. It's just unbelievable. And not only that, but when you go into the Egyptian Museum, they've got thousands and thousands of documents. They're historical documents written in hieroglyphics, which we now can understand. If you go to the tombs of the pharaohs, there's stories telling about their lives, all painted on the walls in the most beautiful colors, which have lasted till now. From 2000 BC to 2000 AD, 4,000 years worth of beauty that's there on the walls. So the question obviously is there to be asked, which is this, that if the pharaohs wrote everything down, and if the escape of the Jews was so miraculous, and the 10 plagues were so clearly indicated, and then the Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea when the Red Sea came together after the Jews passed through. The obvious question that I would ask is, okay, let's see, what does it say in Egyptian history about all this? Because they wrote everything down. They have lists of taxes paid by different peoples at different times. They have pictures of victories of pharaohs over all kinds of different enemies. They have pictures of black slaves coming from Africa to work, on the structures that were being built. They don't only have stories of victories, they have stories of defeats. They have stories where pharaohs lost battles to different enemies all around. So with such a remarkable list of history that are recorded in ancient times by the Egyptian scribes on the one hand, and you've got the miracle of the Exodus on the other hand, surely you would think that somewhere in some document it would be mentioned. So is it mentioned or isn't it mentioned? What do you think? No, the answer is no, it's not mentioned. So that leads us to think, well, could this have been a complete invention? Could this have been a story that was made up 1,000 years after it supposedly happened in order to sort of give an explanation to the sort of foundation of the Jewish people? So that is one of the several theories that are being purported, which is that the whole Exodus story is made up. It was written down 1,000 years after it supposedly happened. And it serves as a kind of an allegory to explain how the Jewish people were formed. So that's one theory. There's other theories that are less radical, we'll say, and perhaps more logical, because we know that in most epics, wherever they're written about, when they're written about past history and heroism and victories and all these things, there seems to be the story in a way is so detailed that the logic is there has to be some sort of grain of truth in this whole foundational epic. And there's different scholars who've gone to try to figure out what this could be. I remember reading a man named Immanuel Velikovsky, who was a physicist, who was an amazing scholar, physicist, linguist, a man of the ages, who really had mastered several completely different elements of human knowledge. And what he tried to do was incorporate astronomy and physics into explaining how the 10 plagues could have happened. And it's quite a fascinating theory. Needless to say, no one knows for sure, but it was a kind of a theory of how to explain how these plagues could have arisen. And he believes it was an asteroid that came close to Earth, which caused all of these different plagues to happen, including the idea of the darkness, the period of darkness that Egypt suffered. Of course, nobody can explain the killing of the firstborn and how that could have happened, but the rest of it, he has an explanation for. It's also one of the clear contradictions in the Exodus story is that the Bible says that they did a census once the Jews got into the Sinai desert, and they found 600,000 men over the age of 20. Now, if you figure it out, 600,000 men over the age of 20 means there must have been something like 2.5 million total people, because you have to count women, you have to count, children under the age of 20. And there's simply no possible way that this number of people could have survived in the desert for 40 years, number one. And number two, they've been looking all over the place and they never found, if people live somewhere for 40 years, you're going to find broken pots, you're going to find houses, you're going to find roads, you're going to find something. And they never found anything. So this story is also a kind of an exaggeration or some sort of a embellishment of something that may have happened. The logical explanation is that the Jewish people were sort of formed out of a group of Canaanites who lived in what we would call today Israel, some of whom went down to live in Egypt at some point because of economic conditions. And at some point, they came back to rejoin the people who have always stayed there. That seems to be about the most logical explanation for this. Egyptian sources also say that there were Semitic tribes, never mentioning Israel, Jews, or anything else, who did come to live in Egypt. And at some point, they even had a ruler appear a couple of hundred years where the what they call Hyksos, which to them meant groups of people from the Middle East, actually had overthrown the Pharaoh monarchy and put up their own kingdom for a little while before they themselves were overthrown. So there is a kind of a bit of a semi-parallel over there, without mentioning the Jews specifically. There is a mention of Israel in the 13th century BC by one of the pharaohs who says that I collected taxes from the Israelites. And that's going way back really to 1300 BC, which is kind of, sort of around where the formation of the Jewish people could be dated to. 1300, 1400 BC, somewhere around there. Now, there's a lot of later sources, Greek sources. So now we're talking, into the 200 BC, 300 BC, all that area, where Greek's sources recount in some way or other the Exodus story. They say something like this, and they repeat the story, but they obviously could have learned it from Jewish sources. There was one famous Greek historian, Plutarch, you might have heard of Plutarch, who mentions that there was a, let me just try and find exactly where I wrote it down. Somewhere I wrote it. Yeah, that the Egyptians had a god called Seth, and Seth was expelled from Egypt, and Seth had two sons named Judah and Jerusalem. So it's kind of weird, but he wrote that down. For biblical scholars who are careful, people who wrote in the 19th century, who really examined the Bible, not from a religious point of view, but from a kind of a linguistic, literary point of view, they came up to the conclusion, basically, that there were two Bibles that were written, one by the Jews who lived in the kingdom of Israel, which would be the 10 tribes of Israel based in Samaria, and another Bible written by the Jews who lived in Judea, based in Jerusalem, including the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And these two groups were rivals, and we know that because it says that after King Solomon died, his empire broke apart, and one son moved up to Samaria, where Nablus is today, would have been the capital, and the other one stayed in Jerusalem. And these two groups lived almost in a competition for several hundred years. So the Jews in the north made their pilgrimage to Samaria to give offerings to the high priest, and the Jews in Jerusalem did the same thing to Jerusalem, exactly in the same way. Those two parallel kingdoms led to two parallel narratives in the composition of the Bible. And the narrative that belongs to Judea doesn't mention the Exodus at all. It doesn't mention the story of the Moses or anything like that. Let me just see exactly what I wrote down, something like that. Yeah, the older prophets, the older prophets, the oldest of whom were around 800 BC, they were prophets in the north of Israel, and they mentioned the Exodus. And the ones in the south didn't. So, for example, who is it now? Is it Jeremiah? Isaiah. Isaiah, one of the most well-written prophets, in all of his prophecies, doesn't mention anything about the story of the Exodus or the rescue or anything like that. So that's why the theory is that there were two kind of parallel tracks that were developed, and eventually, of course, after the kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, the remnants came to live in Jerusalem, and then they made up a kind of a unified version of the Bible. Now, what's also interesting, so we were talking about archaeology and what does it prove or not prove. that all the archaeology that's been done in Israel, much of it, not all of it, but much of it does go to confirm things that were written down in the Bible. So the cities of Megiddo and Hazor and Jerusalem, they're all there. Archaeology points to people living there. It points to battles. It points to destructions. It points to walls and all kinds of things that are mentioned in the Bible. In some ways, in quite an accurate way. But when it came to Egypt or the Sinai, it's a complete nothing. So that makes one think that this story of an Exodus had some element of truth somewhere in it, but that was then kind of worked backwards to create a story of the creation of the people and Mount Sinai and the Torah, as opposed to the normal idea that the Jews were always living in Israel since the formation of their people, and they were closely related to the Canaanites who were living there among them and whom they came from. And even the Bible says that the Canaanites didn't disappear from Israel once Joshua invaded and conquered the land, because they were living there for hundreds and hundreds of years along with the Jews who were living there. And the Jews were worshiping all the Canaanite idols. Like time after time it's mentioned, stop worshiping the Canaanite idols. So it means that these people lived together for a very long time. Yeah, let me just see here. But there's also other curiosities, okay? So in other words, you say, okay, so this whole story is made up, but the names, some of the names in the Bible, like Moses, a big example, is an Egyptian name. Pinchas in Hebrew, or Phineas in English, is an Egyptian name. Aaron is an Egyptian name. So where did that come from? So there must have been some sort of Egyptian influence, but remember, this whole period that we're talking about, when the formation of the Jewish people in Israel happened, it was the Egyptians that was ruling over that territory all that time. So it wasn't as if the Egyptian rule stopped where it stops today, or even stopped at the Nile River. The Egyptians ruled over the Middle East for a very long time. And just the other day, I was reading that a kid picked up a scarab, which one of these, like a beetle, sort of a piece of jewelry. They've just found it just walking around. And it dates from somewhere around 1400 BC, which is exactly the time that we're talking about the formation of the Jewish people. So there was lots and lots of Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion, Egyptian style, Egyptian ceramics in Israel at the time when all of this happened. So it's possible, certainly, that some Jews could have taken Egyptian names, and that could be the origin of this story, rather than that the Jews were in Egypt for 400 years, and then they got freed, and then they, left. So it's a good speculation. Now, I have to say, finishing off this little story, that when I went down to look at all of those Egyptian antiquities, I was looking somewhere where it said built by Moses. Moses built this pyramid and put his name on it, put a little engraving on it, built by the Jewish slaves, something like that. But, didn't happen. There was nothing like that. It's if any of you have a desire to visit, or it crossed your mind to visit Egypt, I would give it a 1000% recommendation. There was absolutely no anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish signs or posters or feelings anywhere the whole time I was there. And it was just, it's something, you know what? It's something like you're not actually going to the country of Egypt. What you're doing is looking at world civilization, because what those people did is a gift to the whole wide world. Nothing else was ever done on that scale at that time by anybody. So you're really looking at something that the human beings created so long ago that's still there for everyone to go and have a look at. So then another question comes up, since we're on that subject. Well, are the Egyptians of today the same as the Egyptians of yesterday? I mean, it's a clear and logical question. The Egyptians of today are Arabic speaking. The Egyptians of today are 90% Muslim. The Egyptians of those days were neither, obviously. So is it the same people, or are they different people? Or do the Egyptians of today have any connection to, or feel any connection to, the ancient Egyptians? And the answer is yes, they feel lots of connection. The closest connection is felt by the Egyptian Christians, who are called Copts, because Christianity came to Egypt very, very early on. In other words, within 150 years of Jesus's death and the foundation of Christianity, Christianity came to Egypt. The people who were living in Egypt in those days, they spoke the Egyptian language, they spoke Greek. Those would be the two main languages, because it was conquered by the Alexander the Great, and then the Romans superseded the Greeks, but Greek remained pretty well the standard business language of the country. But the Egyptian language was spoken for a long, long time and incorporated into the prayers of the church, of the Egyptian Coptic Church. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which is that amazing trilingual tablet describing some history, it was found by the French when Napoleon invaded Egypt. Some French soldiers found it, and up until then, there was no ability to understand the hieroglyphics or what the hieroglyphics meant. They were all over the place, in every tomb, on every obelisk, in every stele, in other words, a piece of rock with an inscription on it. The hieroglyphics were everywhere, but the ability to read them and understand them was completely lost. So they didn't know the meaning of the hieroglyphics, and they didn't know the sound of the words of the hieroglyphics. They didn't know if the hieroglyphics were some sort of sign language, like, say, Chinese, where you have a bunch of symbols that represent different things, or could it have been some kind of an alphabet? They didn't know that either. They knew absolutely nothing. When the Rosetta Stone was found, it had 3 languages on it. It had the hieroglyphics, it had a simplified Egyptian system of writing derived from the hieroglyphics, and it had Greek. So right away, they understood immediately what that whole tablet meant, because they could translate from Greek and go backwards. And from that, they figured out that the hieroglyphics was not, even though it looks like sign language, it's not. It's actually an alphabet. Just using pictures of animals and pictures of water and pictures of all kinds of things to make up the language. So they knew what it meant. They figured out that the hieroglyphics was actually a kind of an alphabet, but they didn't exactly know what it sounded like, until one guy had the brilliant idea of, let's go to the Coptic church and the prayers, and let's see what they sound like. So when they found they just did a kind of a translation of the Coptic prayers, and they matched it because they already knew the sound, they already knew the letters that were in the hieroglyphics, and they sort of put two and two together to say, okay, you know what? Now we know what this sounds like, because a lot of the words in the Egyptian Coptic were the same as in ancient Egyptian. So that's how they worked their way backwards to actually now be able to not only understand what the hieroglyphics are, but to actually sound them out and how it's spoken. So that's how that is. And the idea of the alphabet sort of came exactly, the alphabet that we used was developed in a certain sense in the same way that they took a symbol of an object like a door. Let's say a door begins with a D sound. So if you write a picture of a door, you're not using a hieroglyphics to say this is a door. You're saying this is a D sound because door begins with a D. And that's how our alphabet developed, right? We know bait means a house. So they drew a picture of a house to represent a B sound. So that's how our alphabet is developed. And to this very day, that's exactly how it works. So anyway, that's about that. I just thought that we talk a bit of the Passover story. And to summarize, there's absolutely no indication in any Egyptian writing that the Passover story ever occurred in Egypt. Let's look at some other stuff now. Okay. I read this interesting little paragraph. We're going now back to current events. So we know how Trump is so fixated on cars and the car tariffs that he's put on. So he's put on tariffs of 25% on all cars from all around the world, including cars from Canada and Mexico, the parts that are not made in the US. And all the car companies are telling him this is going to raise the price of cars anywhere from $4,000 to $12,000 per car. And you will notice that he's starting to get nervous about that. And he may be in this coming week, because you don't know what he's going to say and do, he may be changing his mind on cars because of the complaints by the American car companies saying that there is no possible way that we could manage to manufacture a car completely in the US. And therefore, if you're going to charge tariffs on all non-US parts, the car prices are just going to go up so high that we won't be able to sell as many cars. Therefore, our own manufacturing plants will have to go down. And the population will be very upset because they won't be able to afford a car. So you're going to see this week he's going to be doing some hemming and hawing and some who knows what. So I read an article, and I think it was, I can't remember where it was, but it gave the statistics about cars, and I thought that it would be interesting to learn about it. So Trump's complaint is that the US car manufacturing industry went down because of unfair trade by foreign countries sending their cars into the US. And because there's no protection on cars, therefore, fewer cars are sold in the US by American makers. Therefore, there's fewer jobs in the US car industry. So this article goes and takes a look at the history of US manufacturing of cars. And the three conclusions it came up with are this: that the explanation for the reduction of the US car manufacturing jobs is number one, automation. So the use of robots in and the use of robots and the more computer-oriented way that the car parts are delivered to factories and lined up in factories tells a reason why there's fewer jobs. In I forget the year it was, somewhere. I wrote it down somewhere. Anyway, it could be 1988. It took 50 hours to assemble a car in a US manufacturing plant. Today, it takes 18 hours. So obviously, right, if you figure it out, it's kind of 3 times less. So you need 1/3 of the workers can make the same amount of cars as were made back in 1988. The second reason for the reduction of jobs and cars is because the United States went through a period which I hope you may remember in 1980s and the 90s where they made really terrible cars. I mean, the cars were so bad that, yeah, some of them were pulled off the road, like the Corvair. You might remember that one. The Pinto, you might remember that one. There was a car called the Chevy Nova, which in Spanish means it doesn't go, Nova. So they say it was very aptly named, you know. People just said, you know, because what happened was, and I do have the figure here, that 80% of all cars, let me look at it just to make sure here. In the 1970s, early 70s, 80% of all cars sold in the US were made in the US. So if they had a monopoly, they could come up with any kind of crap that they wanted. And what happened was it was only starting in the late 70s or middle 70s, I would say, because I bought one in 72, that the Japanese started to come up with decent cars that could challenge the American cars for quality and price. And when that happened, people started to shift to foreign cars. After Japan, it was Korea, who now make up, you know, the bulk of foreign cars that are sold in the US. So to give you an idea, in 2024, in 1970, 80% of cars sold in the US were made by American companies in the US. Today, that number is 38%. So that means that something like 62% of all cars sold in the US are made by foreign companies, or are foreign cars imported into the US altogether, you know, all ready to go. So that's a huge drop in, you know, in purchases, because the reputation that they lost that in those days is still hard to make up today. Foreign car producers are just better at making good designs that people want. And that's why the American car sales are such a low proportion of all the cars made in the US. So there are, but if that's the case, so I was saying that the number of Americans working in car manufacturing is not much different now than it was back then. So how could that be if American companies are selling so few cars? The answer is that foreign companies have opened plants in the US, like Honda, like Toyota, like all the other ones, Mazda, BMW. They all have plants in the US. There are 5 million foreign cars built in the US today, but owned by foreign companies like Toyota, Honda, and 4.6 million cars made by GM, Ford, and Chrysler. So there's actually more foreign cars being made in the US than there are American cars made in the US. But obviously those workers in those plants are American workers working in a Honda plant or you know, a Toyota plant or all those other plants. When those foreign companies came to the US, and they only started coming, you know, in the late 90s, we'll say, and then 2000s, they didn't open their plants by and large in the Northeast, where the American car plants were. They went down to the Middle South and the South. Why? Because of better treatment of bosses by the law. So they didn't have any compulsory unions. They didn't have any compulsory union dues. They didn't have an atmosphere that encouraged organized labor. On the other hand, they had an atmosphere that discouraged unions. So they figured that they could get a better working relationship on their own terms if they moved to the south. And that's what they did. Now, when NAFTA came in, of course, then the NAFTA, meaning the North American Free Trade Agreement, so that was signed in 1994. And because labor was cheaper in Mexico for sure, and in Canada, considering the dollar, many American companies opened plants in Mexico and in Canada. So they had them there before, and they just sort of, whatever they had before, they built up on after NAFTA was created. So now, if you want to look at, so we said that um, uh, roughly actually 10 million cars are actually manufactured in the US every year. Of those 10 million, 1 million are exported, meaning they're sent out of the US to Canada or Mexico or somewhere else in South America usually. But besides that, where are the cars coming from in the US? So I have 2.5 million come from Mexico as part of NAFTA. Then you have 1.4 million from Korea, 1.3 million from Japan, 1 million from Canada, and then 400,000 from Germany. So if you take NAFTA as a whole, Canada, America, and Mexico, they account for something like 13.5 million cars. So there's more cars built in the US than are built in Canada and Mexico put together. So when Trump is complaining that they're being flooded by Canadian and Mexican cars, it's not true. Like I said, there's about 10 million cars are being built in the US, and 2.3 million are built in Mexico and Canada going into the US. Now, some of the cars built in Canada and especially Mexico don't go to the US. They may go from Mexico to Canada, but a lot of them are sold in Mexico itself and are sold in South America to other customers. So, but of course, it's the American companies that own those plants in Mexico and Canada. So remember that too. It's like, you have to think about the whole car industry as being an integrated one, from the ownership to the workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the conclusion of this article was that America has 2/3 of all the production of cars in North America, that 55% of all cars sold in the US are made in the US, and that even if somehow or other these companies were forced to relocate their plants, it would take years and years for it to happen. And also, there wouldn't be the jobs there because everything is automated anyway. The kind of jobs that there would be jobs for higher skilled people, people used to working with computers, people used to working to integrate computers with production. And it's not jobs for young high school graduates, who were the traditional auto workers back in the 1960s. So anyway, I just thought that that was an interesting article. And the panicked cries of the presidents of the big three auto companies to Trump, saying this is a big mistake, and you're going to pay. Everyone is going to pay for it in the end, and it will be paid to such a point where the danger would be that if the prices of cars go up so much that people can't afford the standard American cars, the luxury cars from Germany, Great Britain, people have money to buy those things. They're not going to stop buying BMWs or Porsches or stuff like that because the price goes up by $10,000. But people, if a car goes up from, say, 35,000 to 45,000, people will just say, no, I can't buy it. So it'll be American companies who suffer more from the tariffs than foreign companies. That was the kind of message that was put out by this article. See how we're doing here, okay? Let's talk a little bit about the Canadian election. You know, it's so strange when the news is so focused, our news envelope is so focused on the United States because the United States is, the president is making such news every day. He fills up the television with news. He fills up the newspapers with news. He fills the whole world up with news. He makes announcements that are so unbelievably newsworthy that it's impossible to ignore them. Today he said the United States is not going to vote to condemn the terrible Russian attack on Sumy in the Ukraine. You know, just like that. We're not doing it. He said the United States is not going to take back this man who they mistakenly sent to El Salvador, even though the Supreme Court said you have to take him back. He said, I'm not doing it. He said today that he's going to take away the designation of Harvard as a university and call it a political organization because it's against him. And if it's a political organization, he could tax Harvard, and instead of a university being tax-free. So, I mean, there's just no end of unbelievably spectacular things that come out of him. So it's impossible to ignore. And especially things that make such a big difference, like tariffs make a huge difference, because tariffs mean practical decisions for companies to make things, to sell things, to buy things, to distribute things. I mean, how do you know what you're going to charge for something if you have no idea if there's a tariff on it or not on it? So in a certain sense, the volatility of the stock market that we've seen, which has been mostly down since he took over, but there have been a few huge up days when he sort of changes his mind. I mean, that takes up the whole news. Now, who in the United States is going to pay attention to a Canadian election? The answer is nobody. I would bet that 95% of Americans couldn't even identify who the top two contenders are in our election. Whereas we all knew it was Trump against Harris. I mean, who didn't know that? Because the news that we consume is American-based, even if it's Canadian news. You know, if you look at the headlines of the CBC, they talk about Trump and tariffs. They're not talking about the Canadian election. The Canadian election is going to take place in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Is there massive amounts of posters and bulletin, what do you call them, billboards all around the country? I mean, there were billboards in the States going, you couldn't stop from one place to another without seeing billboards. Yes, there's pictures of candidates on telephone poles. That's about all. But there's nothing on those posters that says anything. Doesn't say why you should vote for this one or why you shouldn't vote for that one. You know, but in the U.S. they had pictures. You know, I don't know what. You know, Harris is a stooge. Harris is a traitor. Who knows what? They put up all kinds of stuff. Now, you know, one of the differences is that in the U.S., companies or corporations are allowed to have a political life. They're allowed to advertise, they're allowed to promote things, they're allowed to write things, they're allowed to publish things, they're allowed to do whatever they want. They're allowed to give money by the millions of dollars to any candidate they want. In Canada, we have laws that do exactly the opposite. You know, everyone is limited to a small donation, and corporate entities are not allowed to have any kind of political action committees or any of those kind of things that they have in the U.S. Still, given the fact that we're in this unusually turbulent times, you would think that in a Canadian election, there would be a lot more sparks. There would be a lot more, I don't know what, excitement than we have at this point, 2 weeks away yet. So I think, to my way of thinking, this is wonderful. This is amazing. It shows what a great country Canada is, that the results of elections don't matter very much in the daily lives of the people, that there's such consensus over the main pillars of government and the main philosophy of government, that it really doesn't matter. Our lives will be no different whether the Conservatives win or the Liberals win. And in the last election, where the NDP was a bigger force, whether the NDP would win, we really would make almost zero difference in our lives. And that's great, because it means that the country is not divided the way the US is divided. The remarkable rise of the Liberal Party since Trudeau stepped down is really kind of a history-making change, that the Canadian population all over the country could decide all in one time that the Liberals are suddenly good and the Conservatives are suddenly less good. If you look at the charts, it's just like two lines crossing each other, one going up and one going down. But you know, nothing lasts forever. And we all know that when a new leader of a political party is selected, very often you see a bump in the polls for supporting that party. To my mind, unfortunately for Harris, that bump was very small. When Biden resigned and she got nominated, there was a little bit of a bump, but nothing like the bump that we see here between Trudeau and Carney. So, you know, gravity has a way of acting, and it would not be surprising for me or for you to see that the Conservatives are going to gain back some of the support that they lost after Carney was selected. So I don't think that the election has been decided yet, even though the polls are showing that there would be a huge Liberal victory. What is quite remarkable is that these two parties have sucked up all of the air in the country, and that the smaller parties, no matter whether they're the Bloc Québécois or the NDP or the Green Party or even the PPC party, they've all lost support because Canadians have taken the threats of the US so seriously that they say it's not time to dabble in green politics. It's not time to dabble in Quebec separation. It's not time to dabble in social democracy and you know, native rights and all kinds of stuff that the NDP might emphasize. What we need is something to confront Trump. And whoever is the stronger, better confronter is the person that's going to get the Canadian vote. And that seems to be what Canadians have settled upon. And between the two leaders, Carney and Poilievre, they seem to have settled on Carney partly because Poilievre's attitude to Trump was a bit less hostile when Trudeau was in office, because he was adopting some of his mannerisms and some of his kind of populism. And so Trump is such a, we'll call it such a poison in Canadian life, that Canadians are trying to get as far away from him as possible. And they're looking for somebody who could be a strong leader and as somebody who's not in any way associated with Trump or any of his ideas. So that's kind of a mood that has taken over the whole country. And what's so interesting is that it's taken over the whole country. So, you know, you would think that, well, maybe in one place or another place it would be different. You know, Canada is a very diverse country. It's a very huge country. It's got lots of different kind of people living in it. And this move toward the Liberals has been happening from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. In areas that are strongly conservative, they're less strong conservative. In areas that were strongly liberal, they're more strongly liberal. In areas that were strongly for the Bloc Québécois, they're less strong for the Bloc Québécois. In areas that are strong for the NDP, they're less strong for the NDP. So this whole kind of change has happened all because of Trump. And, you know, in a certain sense, you could say it was a gift to Canada to make Canada realize how, number one, fragile the country is if the US decides to get tough. And on the other hand, how strong the country is when the people decide to act together for a certain goal. So that's really I would say, a roundup of the election to date. Voting starts very soon in the advanced polls. Of interest, okay, we don't have a law that says that you have to prove your citizenship in order to vote. You have to prove a residence. You have to have your Medicare card or driver's license. It shows your address on it, but you don't have to prove that you're a citizen. Now, President Trump has tried to introduce a law saying that you have to prove that you're a citizen in order to vote in United States federal elections. Now, that's what the law says. It says that in the same law in Canada. You can't be a landed immigrant without citizenship. You can't be a tourist. You can't be a foreign student. You can't be a foreign businessman to vote in a Canadian election. You have to actually be a citizen. But there's no demand to prove it. Okay, the only way that you could theoretically prove it is to come up with either a birth certificate or a passport. Pretty well, that would be about it, or a Nexus card. That would be a proof. That would be a proof of citizenship, and we're not asked to provide that because the fact is that there's not very many non-citizens who vote in Canadian elections. And there's very, very few non-citizens who vote in American elections. That's been tested, it's been shown. President Trump doesn't believe that. He thinks millions and millions of non-citizens voted in the United States, all against him. So that's why he wants to put this law in effect. But there's only one problem. The United States elections are not run by the federal government. The United States elections are run by the state governments. Therefore, he cannot pass a law in federal elections requiring the states to do something because it's up to the states to decide how they run elections. Just to give some examples, I mean, the states can decide when polls open and when polls close. The states can decide whether mail-in ballots are allowed or not allowed, or what's the last date you can have on a mail-in ballot. The states decide the eligibility for each and every candidate. Some of the states, if they wanted to, could say, well, you have to be 30 years old to be a candidate. That's not a federal law. These are all state laws. The states decide how the votes are being counted, how they're tabulated. So everything is run by the state. You've got 50 different state elections that happen all at the same time on a US federal election. Whereas in Canada, it's not like that at all. We have one election, it all goes at the same time. The provincial, let's say, identities or elements in the election are not there. So that's a big difference. So if Trump thinks he can impose a national law on elections, the Constitution of the US says that's not the way it works. It says the states shall decide an election. The states will elect their representatives. Those representatives eventually, form an electoral college. That electoral college goes to Washington and then votes for the president. That's it. There's no direct vote in the United States for president. The president is on the ballot, but the candidate who wins the most votes for president doesn't get to be president. We all know that because Hillary Clinton won more votes than Trump the time that she lost. And up until this election, when Trump did get more votes than Harris, the Democratic candidate always got more votes. So it doesn't go that way. But anyway, it's just another way that the president of the United States is trying to break convention, break the Constitution, threatening judges that they'll be fired if they don't judge his way, awarding himself and his family huge contracts. Every single thing that he does is just so out of the mean of the way presidents have acted up until now that he's breaking new or setting new standards every single time. And it makes you wonder, let's suppose the Democrats win the next election and there's a guy like Trump who's a Democrat, would the Republicans complain at all? Or would they say, oh no, our guy did it, I guess this guy can do it too, or this woman can do it too? It's just so, it's just, that's why the whole room and that's why the whole news arena is just filled up with Trump. He's just so off the wall that you can't report on anything else. Anyway, I wanted to just see if I had anything else I want to speak about. Maybe yes, maybe no. No, not for now. So an hour has passed. Nobody fell asleep. I'm just checking. Nope, nobody. Terrific. That's always my test. Okay, if I've managed to keep everybody awake, because so many times, I sit down with these really hard to read foreign affairs journals, scholarly journals about foreign affairs and politics, and the next thing I know, I'm fast asleep. So, this is a good test. You notice I didn't mention the Middle East this time. We'll talk about it next time. I did want to mention, in case you haven't heard, on May 1st, so it's coming up again in 2 weeks, the Israel Day celebration will be taking place at McDonald Park on McDonald Avenue, between Isabella and Dupuy. So if you want to come celebrate there, that's the place. Oh yes, that's right. Of course, Trump picked up all kinds of people he didn't like, picks them up right off the university campuses and says, I'm expelling you. He canceled the visa of 500 students this week and said, I'm shipping you out. So it's really, in a certain sense, I can understand the satisfaction and relief of the Jewish community to say, these guys are all anti-Semitic troublemakers, good riddance. But it doesn't take much to change that into, suppose he picks up all kinds of other people for all kinds of other reasons. That line is very thin. If he decides he doesn't like somebody one day, it could be anybody for any reason. So I would say for those of the Jewish community who are strong supporters of Trump because of his so-called support of Israel and his support of against anti-Semitism, I would just say, keep your fingers crossed in your back pocket because this isn't going to last. Okay, so questions, comments? Yes, over there, yeah. You have to speak a bit louder, please. Right, his new favorite country. I thought Russia was his favorite country. Now he's got El Salvador. The president of El Salvador, Mr. Bukele, who is of Palestinian origin, by the way, he came to visit Trump. Mr. Bukele is an extremely popular president in El Salvador. The country was completely devastated by gang wars, drug wars, murders. It had the highest murder rate of any country in the world, measured depending on how you want to measure it. And what he decided to do was he said, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to build prisons to hold 60,000 people. El Salvador has about 2.3 million people, somewhere like that. After he built the prisons, he said, I am going to arrest anybody between the ages of 18 and 25 who I don't like. And I don't care what they did or what they didn't do. If they look suspicious, I'm telling the cops to arrest them and put them in jail. And so they did. They arrested 80,000 people. So they arrested somewhere around 5% of the total population of the country and put them in jail. And you know what happened? The murder rates dropped. The drug wars stopped. All the big gang leaders were put in jail. They weren't able to buy their way out the way they used to be able to do. And the country is now turned into a place where you could go at night to parts of the cities that you couldn't go to before. Now, that was such a successful operation that it caught the eye of course, President Trump, who says, look, I want to jail lots of people. I don't want judges to look over the shoulder and see what, did we cross our I's and dot our T's and cross our I's? You know what? I'm going to pay El Salvador $20,000 per person to put our American prisoners in their jails. And that's the deal that he did. So it costs a lot more, by the way, to house an American prisoner in an American jail. Some figures that I saw were somewhere around $50,000 a year when you count up, the food, the staff, the structure of the building, the maintenance and all that. It's like a hotel, okay, which serves 3 meals a day. Now, I'm not saying that 3 meals a day are cruise style meals, but it's still 3 meals a day. Plus, they need to have medical care. They need to have psychiatric care. They need to have recreation. They need to have all kinds of stuff. Better send them to El Salvador and let them worry about it for $20,000 a year. And El Salvador is uniquely equipped because they built all these prisons. They got lots of extra space. They have trained guards. Nobody's watching what those guards are doing. So it's a perfect combination, a perfect deal, as Trump would say. So that's what he's doing. He said that he would only send dangerous gang members to El Salvador. But of course, he sends anybody. He just picks them up and sends them. The guy who they sent was, not a gang member. But once you have the train going, you might as well fill it up. That's the idea. So that's about El Salvador. But I'll tell you one thing, that El Salvador is now making we'll call it the publicity of a place for tourists to come visit, because now it says we're safe. We have volcanoes, we have jungles, we have ocean. El Salvador is going to become the new, I don't know what, Costa Rica, for all you know. And all because of this elimination of the gangs thing, But you ask yourself one little question. If all the 18 to 25-year-old men or young men are in jail, like, who's going to make the babies? What's going to happen in 20 years? Like, where are the people going to be, Anyway, I don't think that Mr. Bukele is worried about that. He is really popular because he made the average people's lives safer, better in the country. So, even though he has an Arab name, an Arab first name, an Arab last name, Nayib is his first name. Think of, imagine the United States, well, they elected a Barack Obama, so there, I guess you could say that works there too. But anyway, that's El Salvador. It's, you have to speak louder, I'm sorry. Well, first of all, the U.S. attorney who represented the United States in the case admitted that it was a mistake to arrest him. That attorney was fired by the U.S. because they said, you're not supposed to say that we did anything wrong. So they fired her. I think it was a her. Say, you're supposed to represent the United States right or wrong, and you can't admit the truth. You're just supposed to be there to make our case. So she got fired. His lawyers went to court to say, hey, you sent him there, to send him back. The United States says, well, we don't have any authority over a foreign country. We can't force that country to take him back. So the court said, well, but you have to do whatever you can to, what did you do to try to get him back? Did you even ask the head of El Salvador to send them back? They said, no, we never asked. So, and then now that El Salvador's president came to the US, he said, no, we're not going to send them back. Why? Because that's what President Trump wants. Because to send him back would mean admitting a mistake. It would mean a lawsuit. It would mean costs. Imagine if the opposition said, well, how much did this whole fiasco cost? You arrested him. You sent him by plane to El Salvador. You paid $29,000, and now you have to send him back. What did your mistake cost the taxpayer? They don't want to have to answer that question. Better leave him in El Salvador. Who cares? At this point, nobody dares to stand up because he's proven that standing up to him could be so costly that no one wants to risk it. At this point, there are some. The more insulated you are, the more able you are to stand up. So, for example, a senator who's elected for 6 years has the most ability to stand up to Trump. A judge who is on the Supreme Court, let's say, who is there for life, they don't have to worry that he's going to get fired or she's going to get fired by Trump. So there've been a bit of nibbling around the edges, we'll call it, of opposition to Trump by the Supreme Court and by some of the senators. Especially the thing that bothers the senators especially is the tariffs. That's one thing. And the second thing is the relationship with Canada, because there's so many Canadians who go to the States and spend money in the States that they're feeling this boycott. And they're telling, why pick on Canada of all places? And there was a vote in the Senate to say that unless the tariffs are removed from Canada, they specifically talked about Canada, within 60 days, the tariffs will be automatically dropped. And this was a bill that was voted on by the Senate, including 4 Republicans who changed sides in order to make it pass. But of course, the bill would then have to go to the House of Representatives, which I heard they may try to do. But the president, of course, will just not sign it. He doesn't have to sign it. The president is allowed to veto any bill he doesn't like. So that isn't going to happen. But it means that there is some opposition, some not just rumor opposition, but some actual on the ground, on paper opposition to what he's doing at this point. But he's only gotten started. Remember, it's April, not even April 20th. He only got into office January 20th. It's like nothing. So if these tariffs are allowed to proceed, and prices will definitely go up, the Democrats called it the largest tax increase ever passed in American history. So people will feel it, and the local representatives will hear from their constituents. So that's where the opposition will come from. It's not going to come because of kicking out Palestinians. It's not going to come because of transgender toilets. It's not going to come because you withdrew grants from universities. It's not going to come because of any kind of foreign aid thing like the Ukraine or something like that. People in America don't care about any of those things. If Trump just would have continued on that sort of cultural anti-woke business, he would have been in a lot better spot than now because of the tariffs, because that's affecting the lives of every single person. And his popularity, his approval rating is way down, way down. No, he doesn't have to care. He's there for 4 years. And also him talking about running for a third term. Everybody knows Trump is Trump. He says all kinds of stupid things. So it's only the economic results of what he's doing that will be the measure of how successful he is. Let me see if there's anyone else. Yeah, over there, yeah. Yeah, I have to speak louder. This one thing I'm asking, yeah. Yeah, right. Oh, when was the church founded? It was founded, the Coptic church, so the word Coptic is related to the word Egypt. You think of that, though, those two things mean the same thing. So the Egyptian Christian church, supposedly Saint Mark, who was one of Jesus's apostles, went down to Egypt to bring the message of Christianity to the Egyptians. And it proved to be a success in the sense that a lot of Egyptians converted to Christianity long before, say, Romans or Greeks converted to Christianity. So it is one of the earliest churches, meaning like between 100 and 200 AD, the church already got started. And it has some very peculiar and particular practices, one of which is the idea of what's kind of monks and nuns going to live in very isolated places to live a life of complete abstinence in a cave, in a desert, somewhere far away where they can just pray to God, say the prayers every day, live off of almost nothing. And the worse off their lives are, the more holy they feel that they are. And they're all scattered all through Egypt, up and down the Nile River. There's all kinds of places. No, not monasteries. There's a word that I'm looking for, where these people went to live. And that's one thing. The second thing is that church is an independent church. So it doesn't come under the administrative leadership of the Pope, and it doesn't come under the administrative leadership of the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in Istanbul. In actual fact, it is related to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So technically the Pope, and that's what they're called, popes, the Pope of the Coptic Church in Egypt is also the sort of titular head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. So those two churches are related because Christianity came to Ethiopia from Egypt. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is that in Egypt there are 10 million Christians. So this isn't the case like in Syria or in Lebanon or in Iraq or other places in the Middle East or Turkey, where there's just a handful of Christians left, older people who are just barely hanging on to survive. This church in Egypt is active. I was, driving around Cairo, I saw new churches being built all the time, all over the place. And the other thing is, it's not like the church is just in the cities. Like in a lot of places in the Middle East, the Christians kind of, we'll call it they're city people. They're people who were involved in trade and things like that. And their main headquarters are in the cities. But in Egypt, these churches are in the tiniest little flea-bitten villages, down the Nile River with, 25 houses, and there's a church there. So it's a different whole, it's a whole kind of different structure from what goes on the rest of the Middle East. Now, for sure, among the Islamic fundamentalists, they don't like the church because it's not Muslim. Um, and there have been attacks on churches. There, you know, when you go by some big churches, you'll see police cars in front of them, just like, you know, they have in the synagogues, in other parts of the world. So there have been attacks on churches in the past. There have been. And 90% of the people are Muslim. So therefore, you know, they do feel that they are in a precarious position for sure. But it's not as if all the Christians in Egypt are wealthy and all the Muslims are poor. It's nothing like that. It's a whole mixture. They're all mixed up like that. Yeah. But you have to say, you have to be louder. How many Jewish people live in Egypt? Well, well, you know what? To the best of anybody's knowledge, and of course, you know, it's very hard to know, it's under 50. I mean, it's really, 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 really few. And you know, it's a history that goes back, you know, very far back. You know, when the Greeks conquered Egypt, a very famous Jewish philosopher called Philo was established in Alexandria, and his writings are still being written, are still being read today. It was one of the strongest, wealthiest Jewish communities in the whole world. And Egypt, by the way, was the wealthiest possession of the Roman Empire. It produced the most taxes, the most products. You know, it was really the king of the hill in its day. Today, unfortunately, you know, it's become really poor, I have to say. You know, you see buildings that were beautiful in their day, but these same buildings today are kind of forlorn looking, unkept up, broken, stuff like that. So, and the people really are suffering. You know, costs are high, salaries are low, unemployment is high. Uh, you know, the country is stable because the alternative is worse, but it's not in a good place right now as far as the living standards of the people are concerned. And the Jews lived, as you know, in Egypt in great numbers. And sort of, I would say maybe that the apex of that community was probably between the First World War and the Second World War, because lots of Ashkenazi Jews came to live in Egypt after the First World War, looking to get away from Europe, looking to get away from the chaos of Europe. And they came to a community that was well rooted, that was extremely well rooted in the country. However, however, like the Jews in the other Arab countries, when Egypt was occupied by the colonial power, in this case, Great Britain, which came in the 1880s, and they opened up schools uh, for anybody. It was Jews, among others, Italians, Greeks, and Armenians. Those four communities formed the business elite of Egypt. And very often, the Jews of Egypt, they knew Arabic, but they didn't really speak it well because they spoke French and Italian and English as their kind of day-to-day languages, but especially French. And, you know, when independence came, of course, when Israel independence came, there were anti-Jewish riots, of course. Egypt fought a war on the 1956, the Sinai War. That really was the icing on the cake. And then the Six-Day War. So, you know, Egypt fought 3 wars against Israel. What's the Jewish community in Egypt going to do? Obviously, the turning point was really when Nasser became the president of the country in 1952-53. And Nasser said, you know, just like Ataturk said in Turkey, you know, all these foreigners who are living here, they're not really Egyptians. The Italians are Italians, the Greeks are Greeks, the Armenians are Armenians, but the Jews, you see, were not Israelis. So, in other words, like the Jews were in a kind of a unique position, even among the foreign community there, in that 2, 3 generations ago, they always lived in Egypt. They didn't come from Italy, 100 years ago when times were good, or French people, or British people like that. You know what I mean? So, I mean, their lives were in Egypt for forever and ever and ever. They were in Egypt before the Muslims came to Egypt. Let's put it like that. So, in just a few short years, the whole community civilization just, emptied out. There's a book called The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. I don't know if any of you saw that book. You heard about that book? It's a wonderful story told by a girl who was about 7, 8 years old when she was forced to leave Egypt with her family. And it tells about her family's life in Egypt and, of course, what happened to them once they left Egypt, which is usually not the best. When any immigrants are forced to leave, sometimes it's very difficult. So the community is really, like I said, down to its lasts. And, as people pass away, that's even less left. The Egyptian government spent $3 million to renovate a synagogue in Old Cairo, which is beautiful. It's open to tourists. Everything is very respectful. It's beautiful. You can go visit it. Lots of people are just walking through, mostly Egyptians, just having a look. But, there's no Jews there to use it. Let's put it like that. In that synagogue called the Ben Ezra Synagogue, it's where in the late 1800s, Schachter, what's his name? One of the founders of the conservative Jewish religion, he found this hidden room called the Geniza in that synagogue, and it had documents going back over 1,000 years, marriage documents, business documents, community documents, and they were all, of course, taken to museums, and it's a life of 1,000 years of Jewish history that was just stored up and closed off in that room up there in the synagogue. Anybody else? No. So thank you so much. Have a rest of a good, happy Passover, and we'll see you all next Tuesday. I want to hope that I could ride my bike here because my legs are getting ready to ride, and so far there's been a conspiracy against me. So